Hey there, everyone. This is Dan Faggella here with TechEmergence, where we interview thinkers and doers at the intersection of technology and psychology. We've had a lot of great philosophers and psychologists who've been on the line with us before. Today, I'm lucky enough to be able to have on the line with me now the founder and director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, author of the recently published Superintelligence, Professor Nick Bostrom himself. Professor, how are you today?
Hey, fine, thanks.
Indeed, glad to have you on here. When I had heard you speak recently at Harvard on your book tour, as you were kind of making your rounds, I was particularly interested in this notion of existential risk. I've read a number of your work. Maybe some of the folks who are tuned in already have as well. It seems as though that's a massive task of determining what are the existential risks, the risks that could really put humanity at stake in terms of destruction in all these various fields, from nanotech to artificial intelligence to robotics or whatever the case may be. How does a thinker like yourself or other folks who are specifically focused in particular fields start to identify what those are and what ones are maybe more reasonable or larger scale risks than others that maybe should yield a little bit more attention?
Yeah, so the concept of an existential risk really is a kind of lens to focus our gaze when we're trying to prioritize between different global concerns.
Yes.
So it tries to direct our attention to those things that could make a permanent difference to our long-term future.
Yep.
In an existential risk is one involving either the extinction of Earth originating intelligent life or the permanent and drastic destruction of our future potential for valuable development.
Yep.
There is no single methodology that
is
applicable to all different existential risks. It's intrinsically an interdisciplinary endeavor. For particular risks, it's possible to quantify them in a rigorous scientific way. Like if you're wondering about asteroids, we have telescopes we can study them with. We can look at past crater impacts and so forth and derive actual hard statistical data on that. And we find that the risk from asteroids is extremely small. And likewise for a few of the other risks that arise from nature. But all the really big existential risks are not in any direct way susceptible to this kind of rigorous quantification.
Yeah.
I think all the really big risks arise in some way out of human activity, and in particular from certain possible future technological discoveries that we might make. And there's just no way to sort of calculate whether the probability that we will be destroyed by super intelligent machines is like 4% or 37%. So there, although there is a lot of relevant information in many different scientific fields, ultimately there is also a big ingredient of just judgment that inevitably comes into play.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we have to try to do to improve our assessment of existential risk is to think carefully about how these judgments are produced, whether there are biases that perhaps we could become aware of and that we can learn to avoid.
Got it.
And this holds more generally when one is thinking about these big picture questions for the future. Like if your task is to hammer a nail into a board, then there is a very strong feedback loop where reality really tells you very clearly whether you're doing it right or not. And It doesn't really matter whether you're like a communist or a Nazi or a Raelian or what crazy ideologies you have. Like you'll still learn quite quickly if you're hammering in the wrong nail. Like your thumb will start hurting in a big way.
Yes.
But if you're wrong about what the major threats are to humanity over the next century, like there is no that reality quickly tells you whether you're right or wrong. So any weak bias you might have has a much freer reign to start to distort your beliefs.
Indeed, and it seems as though, and obviously this makes logical sense, that the folks working away in various individual fields, really, of course, there's no individual methodology. It's more like, hey, the people that are deepest involved in these various fields, so long as they're aware that existential risk is a factor, is a thing, to speak kind of colloquially, they can have their antennae up for what those things might be. And probably the best shot we got is the solid, informed judgment of folks that understand that existential risk exists, who might be able to keep that antennae up when they're working on neuroscience, when they're working on biotech, So it sounds like more people that just understand and can have a kind of a sniff test judgment for existential risk and future ramifications at that scale, maybe having more people with that antennae up is about as good as we got.
Well, it seems on balance helpful to have more sort of practitioners and experts aware of a wide range of existential risks, but not all existential risks are thereby avoided.
For sure, of course.
One has to consider the incentives of a researcher in some field, like, say, synthetic biology, which maybe down the road, decades from now, could, through the cumulative effort of many researchers, create powerful new technologies that might then also be used to responsible and that might create an existential risk. But if you are a researcher in a particular lab, all your incentives are to plow ahead.
Yeah.
Like, you need to get that publication in, you need to get that next grant.
Yeah.
You need to make the exciting discovery that will get you an award or that will give you your tenure. So even if you have some vague awareness that synthetic biology could be dangerous in the long run, it's not clear that the incentives are aligned for you to take the actions that would be best from a global point of view.
Yeah.
So a lot of these existential risks arise ultimately from global coordination failures. Like, we as a humanity doesn't really have any policy where we're trying to steer some particular course into the future. Things just happen. There are a lot of people going about their business who are discovering a lot of things, making some profits, they're making a living, and new technology comes online and so forth. We've been mostly lucky with the technologies we've been developed. They've been a huge boon to humanity and has basically created our current modern condition of unprecedented prosperity. But if there is a really dangerous technology that could be developed, it looks like we are on course eventually to develop it.
Yes, and we'll invariably come up with many more than you and I could brainstorm, no matter how much time we have here today. So that brings us to the next question, which I'm sure folks can dive into in Superintelligence and some of your other work on nickbostrom.com. But in terms of that global coordination problem, I happen to be in agreement there. I don't have the algorithm, I don't have the answer, but it seems as though, being as how interdisciplinary this is, and being how, it is possible to keep your head down. In almost.
My line is cracking up a little bit here.
Can you hear me? Yeah, do you got me now, Nick?
If you try to speak, let me see if I can hear you now.
Okay, how about now?
I think now, yes.
Okay, all right. I'll give it another go. You were coming through a little crackly too, but luckily it was clear enough for me to record. So, the question was, it seems as though there really is a global coordination concern here in terms of, the incentives, as you had said, being. Oh, still again, Nick, having trouble?
Sorry, I can't actually hear you.
No, that's fine. I can edit this audio, Nick. I'm going to switch to my other Wi-Fi. I'll be back in 2 seconds, okay?
I'm not sure whether the problem is on your side or between or on my side here.
Okay.
It sounds almost like there's some sort of glitch in some sort of speaker part or something like that.
Yeah.
But I can sort of hear you to and fro.
Okay. Am I coming through okay now?
Right now it's good, yeah.
Great. Okay, I'll give it a shot. So, I'm interested in your thoughts, Nick, on the global coordination problem. It's clearly massively complex. We would need an interconnected, interdisciplinary, unified effort to sort of be aware of and line up incentives with what's best for human well-being on this large aggregate, bigger scale. How can we get beyond our sort of... Still?
That's fine. But I can't.
Yeah, let me
just hear you sort of.
I'm gonna switch to my other Wi-Fi. Give me.
Shake my phone.
Yeah, give me 1 second here.
Sometimes if you just give something a kick, it suddenly starts working.
Oh.
Hello.
Hey, all right. I'm on a different Wi-Fi now, Nick. Can you hear me?
Okay. Well, right now it sounds good.
All right, thank goodness. Anyway, okay, I'm going to say this quick. Basically, yeah, it seems as though we're talking about a large and interdisciplinary problem, and there is the factor that folks could be focusing away on their own individual little niche interests and potentially not bearing in mind the aggregate consequences for humanity because, admittedly, that's rather difficult. In terms of how we can improve that global coordination, in terms of who's working on what, and how the world's incentives are driving us towards what's aggregately best for us all, how might we even begin to crack that nut in terms of well-intended organization globally?
Yeah, so having improved global coordination, better ability to solve these global commons problems would be very useful for a wide range of different challenges that humanity faces. Not just for various existential risks, but for avoiding wars and arms races, and to like manage the ocean fish population and like clean up the atmosphere and so forth. But it's a very tricky problem. A lot of people have tried for a long time to work towards world peace, and it still remains an elusive goal, although perhaps we have made some incremental progress towards it.
Yeah.
So, broadly speaking, there is kind of two questions one can ask. One is what would be really great if it happened, and clearly a more peaceful, more harmonious world at the international level would be really great for a wide range of reasons. But another question is, what can we as individuals do that would be most effective in improving the long-term chances for humanity? And there it's less obvious that working directly towards global peace is the best project, just because it looks very difficult to make a big difference there if you're like a single individual or a small organization.
Yeah.
And so perhaps your resources would be better put to use if they were focused on some problem that is much more neglected. For example, the control problem for artificial intelligence, like doing some technical research to figure out if and when we got the ability to create machine superintelligence, how we could ensure that the outcome would be safe and beneficial. Or perhaps doing general research on existential risks to try to identify promising ways to reduce the level of existential risk. So those are areas in which, say, $1 extra million of funding or like one extra very talented person could make a noticeable difference.
Yeah. So, do you see it as a most likely scenario that both will happen? In other words, there will be those niche individuals who are hammering away, kind of like the MIRI, Machine Intelligence Research Institute, or what have you, is raising funding and focusing away on kind of a particular set of problems, and that we're more likely to. And then there's another group in nanotech, which I cannot remember the name of off the top of my head, who's working away on sort of foreseeing and potentially bypassing and handling and the level of policy and otherwise the ethical considerations of nanotech. Do you see it more as those individual efforts, maybe within a country or hopefully internationally, but sort of niche, couple $1 million type efforts being more successful in terms of, and then maybe some kind of connectedness between those being what aggregately brings us to some higher level of global collaboration? Or do you see it as borderline essential or maybe even possible to get to a higher level of unified effort in terms of looking at all of these potentially dangerous or massively beneficial technologies?
It might well be feasible. I mean, we've moved over grand historical timescales towards increasing scales of political integration. So
yeah, towards that.
That the tribe was kind of the largest political unit, and you had 50 people in a tribe. So now we have large states and indeed supranational units like the European Union, sort of weak forms of global governance. So there's like only really one step left in that direction, which might take decades, but it could happen. I just think that it's not so much that I think it's very unlikely to happen, it's just that whether or not it will happen will not depend sensitively on any one individual's contributions. There are like larger forces that will shape these outcomes. That's why if one is trying to think as an altruist about the highest expected utility use of one's time and money, there might be other narrower causes that even though they might matter less, you could have a bigger impact on whether they happen and therefore yield a higher expected amount of good.
Because you could move the needle in the first place. So yeah, with that being said, that was my final very short question here, Nick. Was if somebody's tuned in now, we have folks that are entrepreneurs, we have folks that are thinkers and are interested in the research in these domains. If somebody's tuned in, they said, I too see these as massively important considerations. Would you say that on the aggregate, it might make sense to say, what are my resources, what are my skills, who's around me that understands these concerns as well, and what for lack of better terms, what nut could I crack in terms of opening up these ethical considerations or coming to terms with some of the conditions and how we might prepare a little bit better for them in a more specific and niche area? On the aggregate, for the average person tuned in who wants to quote-unquote be involved in a meaningful way in that aggregate altruistic way you were just speaking about, does it likely make most sense to look at opportunities, look at skills, look at where you are now, and drive home the existential projects that you have access to and maybe can make a difference in the first place, in your opinion?
Yeah, so for different individuals that might have different skills and be in different positions to do different things. Broadly speaking, though, it's worth bearing in mind the principle of division of labor. So just as in the larger economy, we specialize in different things and trade, so with existential risk reduction, you could specialize in making money, doing whatever you're good at, and then you could donate a fraction of that to pay people who are specializing in doing like research on existential risk or trying to influence policy, and pay those to do that work. You don't have to try to do it yourself. It's usually more efficient to each do whatever we are specialized in. So for most people, the most efficient way to contribute to reducing existential risk would be to identify the most efficient organizations working on this and then support those.
Is it safe to say in some way, Nick, that the Future of Humanity Institute is to some degree maybe aiming towards the bigger global unified effort that you and I are both saying is maybe a little bit tougher to come across, but maybe aggregately most beneficial? I mean, in other words, is it even worth considering? I know you had mentioned there's forces outside of one man's effort, but I guess such was Napoleon, such was anybody who's in Britannica. Is it worth taking a crack at in any direction? And it almost seems like FHI to some degree is making at least noble strides in that direction. It doesn't seem futile.
No, we are trying to change global awareness about big picture questions for humanity. They have traditionally been neglected. We think there is an opportunity to show that you can do serious research on this and that we can bring them into a wider conversation.
Yeah, as opposed to dung beetles and stuff like that.
Future, we're not just naively assuming the human condition is fixed and the main concern is how to make sure that the nuclear waste that we bury will remain safe for 50,000 years, or these kind of preoccupations there. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and there are some other organizations as well active on various aspects of this problem. You mentioned the Machine Intelligence Research Institute at Berkeley.
Yes.
Some great people there. We are working closely with the Center for Effective Altruism, which is trying to sort of bring reflective rationality to the question of how to do the most good as an individual. And some others. There is a growing ecosystem of people who are genuinely trying to figure out how to save the future. It's worth bearing in mind, although I think this is extremely important, if one steps back and wonders how much influence one as an individual can expect to have. You mentioned the case of Napoleon. There are a lot more people in history who have believed that there were Napoleon than there have actually been in Napoleon. So
that's
probably tens of thousands of people have imagined that there were Napoleon.
Zarathustra said the higher the thing, the rarer its type. I mean, it's the case. The higher you shoot, the more likelihood you have to toil forever and have it yield nothing. But I guess somebody's got to make the shot.
Yeah, and so the values on the line here, if one just works out the numbers, in terms of how many happy lives could exist in humanity's future, and if we spread through the universe and so forth, astronomical.
Astronomical.
Even a very large, even very small probabilistic impact on that would still be extremely worthwhile pursuing.
Indeed, and such is the involvement in kind of that growing ecosystem, as you had mentioned. Folks who are tuned in, if you're interested there's plenty of great institutions. If you go to Future of Humanity Institute's site, they're clearly linking to a lot of the other folks that are working away here. And Nick, I definitely appreciate your advice on getting involved kind of in the ecosystem and seeing where your best fit might be in terms of that yield. Because we're a little bit over on time here, I just wanted to first and foremost say thanks a ton for being able to take the time. But secondly, if folks want to learn more from you, where I've read most of your work, Nick, is at nickbostrom.com, Bostrom. And then you obviously have your new book, Super Intelligence. Anywhere else folks can go to learn more about this topic if they want to be involved and informed?
Well, those would be two great starting places. So my homepage has a lot of papers and stuff.
Yes,
and
indeed.
The new book, of course, Super Intelligence. And you'll find a lot of resources from there if you just follow through.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, Nick's site is a great place to start for anybody tuned in. Professor Bostrom, thank you again so much for being here with us on TechEmergence.
Thanks for the invitation.
Cool.